Today, we will follow the story of Jin, an unlucky boy who was destined to become the patriarch of his clan, but was prevented by a curse. He ended up discovering that he had no talent in swordsmanship. This was ironic since he was part of a renowned clan of swordsmen. The boy was always teased and mistreated by his brothers, until one day he was expelled from his clan. But it was after that his life ended up changing when he met his master, and he discovered his talent for magic, a practice prohibited within his clan. One day while studying magic methods, Jin is enveloped by shadows. It is then that he meets Sodorei, a god who reveals that his lack of talent in swordsmanship was actually caused by a curse. Jin ends up sealing a contract with this god who lifts his curse. However, unlucky, as always, he ends up being attacked minutes after getting rid of the curse. With his eyes closing, he wondered if this was his end, until when he opened his eyes again, he was back to the sword ritual. Our protagonist then realizes that, with the end of his life, he had returned to when he was just a baby. Without wasting time, he chooses the patriarch's sword again, deciding that this time his life would be different. Without further ado, let's start with what this unlucky guy will do to escape these troubles. A clan of swordsmen who dominated half the world. The people of this famous clan were born with powerful bodies and exceptional talents. They managed to excel in various areas such as battles, looting, and domains, and thus dominated the world with their martial powers. And in a world where survival depended on these three actions, our protagonist was born as the youngest son of the Runcandle clan. In the selection ritual that was used to predict the future of the children of this clan, the boy ended up choosing the patriarch's sword. With this he was marked with the destiny of the patriarch, which ended up impressing the patriarch at the time. He also believed that he would have glory and success in his future. However, it all ended when the boy discovered he had no talent for fencing. Everyone called him the least talented of the Runcandle because he couldn't use a sword. As Jin brandishes his sword, someone arrives, calling him. One of his brothers asked why he was brandishing his sword for no reason, and the other brother comments that maybe the boy doesn't want to pick up an ordinary sword, in which case his other brother asks if he had lost his sword. Fatigued, Jin lowered his gaze, tired of the situation. Approaching the boy, the white-haired brother insisted that the boy answer his question. Kicking him in the stomach, the boy said that Jin should answer to his older brothers. With this kick, our protagonist falls to the ground in great pain, and his brother calls him useless trash. The boy just tries to pick up his sword and go back to training, and the black-haired twin asks why he uses the wooden sword. Stepping on his hand, the brother says that it was completely useless. Jin screams in pain, and holding a crumpled notebook, his brother asks if this was basic fencing theory. Mocking the boy, he asks if Jin thought he would achieve anything by studying that kind of thing. Twisting our protagonist's sword, the white-haired brother said that for this reason we shouldn't give chances to useless people, while Jin begged his brother not to do that with the sword. Ignoring Jin, the boy continued saying that because of chances like these they didn't recognize their places, and ended up having useless hopes. The boy could do nothing but watch his sword being broken in front of him. Our protagonist says they didn't need to do that. And holding Jin by the hair, his brother asks what he was saying. Because they did that because they were worried about him, and the boy still told them back. And his other brother questions whether this education had come from his nanny. Gritting his teeth, Jin asks them not to talk about Gilly, so his brothers say that the way he was acting they would have to teach him a lesson. At that time the boy thought that none of that mattered. He thought he just needed to work hard to receive recognition from his family. However, things turned out differently than Jin thought, and the boy ended up being expelled from the clan. Standing in front of the castle gate of the Runcandle clan, our protagonist remembered the words of the clan leader who commented that he was sparing him for his efforts. At age 23, Jin became a wanderer after being expelled from the clan, and thus met his master. And so the boy discovered that his true talent was something forbidden within his family, magic. 3 years later, Jin was studying magic books, when suddenly, a shadow forms right behind the boy, covering him completely. Our protagonist could only see darkness around him. At that moment, someone forces a cough, drawing the boy's attention. Turning around, Jin asked who he was, and the being introduced himself as Sodorei, the King of Shadows. Calling him Jin Runcandle, Sodorei asks him to allow him to propose a contract between them, and the boy is scared after finding out who he was. Continuing, the god says that if he accepted the contract, he could not only use spiritual power, but also cancel curses. At that moment, the entity ends up noticing something about the boy, and he comments that apparently Jin had received someone's wrath when he was younger. Approaching the boy, the god reveals that in fact the boy could not show his talent because of that curse. Hearing this, the boy asks if he was sure, which Sodorei confirms. He explains that it was a curse called Blade Illusion, which suppressed sword talent. In this case, the god comments that it must have been because of this curse that he had been attracted to the boy. Touching his chest, the being removes the boy's ties and says that from that moment on, no curse would affect him. Then he says that from that moment on, the only thing left for the boy was to become the magical swordsman of the century. While leaving the place, Sodorei comments that it would be a pleasure to watch his journey. After that, the boy quickly takes his sword and leaves the house. Wielding the weapon, Jin begins to brandish it, and notices that just as the entity had told him when he picked up the sword, he he was able to see a new level. With great joy on his face, our protagonist realizes that the sword was lighter. From that day on, the least talented son of the Runkandle family was gone. He thought his hard work was finally paying off. As the boy brandished his sword, some people watched him from afar, and all we can see is Jin on the ground. He wonders why his body is so heavy. Closing his eyes, the boy wondered if there was anyone there. Our protagonist realizes that his life would end without him taking advantage of the chance that had been given to him. In this case, he wondered if the hopes he had were false. Jin suddenly awakens and realizes that he was in the body of a child. Looking to the side, he sees people from his clan. He thought that was all. After all, he was sure that he had been sent to eternal rest. His maid wished him good luck with a smile, and the boy wondered what she was doing there. Looking around, our protagonist sees the patriarch's sword. At that moment, he realizes that this was the selection ritual, and that he had gone back to when he was just a 1-year-old baby. Extending his hand, the boy chooses the patriarch's sword, impressing everyone. Jin thought that in his past life he had chosen the sword by coincidence. However, in this life he would choose it for himself. The clan members, seeing that a baby had chosen the patriarch's sword, wondered how that was possible. The clan leader comments that in the end, the youngest had chosen the patriarch's sword. At that moment, the man declared that the selection ritual was over, and said that they should take the youngest son to the Storm Castle. 6 years later, in the Storm Castle, our protagonist was trying to reach a book. However, he was unsuccessful. Jin climbed onto a chair, and as he picked up his book, he thought that since he was already 7 years old, according to the house rules, he had to stay there for another 3 years. For the boy, this was just a waste of time. At that time, he ends up hearing the sound of someone falling. It was his maid, who when asked what had happened, said that there was a dead bird there. Hearing this, our protagonist thought that inside that castle, there was only one person who would do something like that. At that moment, 2 people arrived at the scene, commenting that it was something regrettable. It was about his brothers, who were laughing as they said this. The twin named Daytona comments that it had been a waste though, since it was the servant who had found him. His brother Haitona agrees with Daytona, saying that they had gone to all the trouble just to show Jin. Jin looked at the lifeless bird without his hands, and the bastards asked him what he thought of the gift, and if he was moved to the point of crying. In thought, our protagonist comments that he heard that they gained a bad reputation as assassins after becoming standard bearers. However, boys who were not even 9 years old had put an end to an innocent bird just to harass it, and that crossed the line. Even after doing all this, they were not satisfied, and while smiling they told him not to cry because it would be ugly. Jin remained silent in the corner of the room, and his brothers, seeing that he wasn't responding, questioned whether he was listening to them. Mockingly, Haitona comments that he must think he's great, given his fate, and questions why someone like that would be unarmed without the bear. Our protagonist then whispers something. Unable to understand, Haitona approaches the boy, asking him to repeat it. Again, Jin repeats. However, just like before, his brother ends up not understanding. Already angry, Haitona pulled him by the shoulder, and throwing a punch, he said he wouldn't be able to hear him if he continued speaking quietly like that. However, Jin impresses the boy by stopping the punch easily, showing a lot of aura. He says that the boys were very noisy and tells them to shut up. In the next second, our protagonist hits the white-haired boy with a punch to the chin. After that, the boy tries to complain, but before he can say anything, he is hit by another punch from Jin, this time in the stomach. Emanating a dark aura from his fists, Jin says that from that moment on he would no longer hold back, and he recommends that from that day onwards they do not irritate him from that day onwards. At that moment, a man enters the room asking about what had happened to the young masters. Jin then quickly dispels his magic by calling out to the man. The man questions what had happened there. As Khan carries the boys, Jin explains that the young masters had suddenly started fighting, which the man finds strange. With a full look, our protagonist wonders if he hadn't heard, and repeats that the two fought and ended up collapsing. Khan in thought commented that as expected, even the youngest of the Runkandle was brutal. Standing up, the man says that in that case he would take them to the doctor, and Jin denies it, saying that his brothers should go somewhere else, asking him to follow him. Amidst the rain, dressed in a coat, our protagonist buried the bird. We also see his fainted brothers, who were lying next to the tomb. At that moment, Khan asks Jin if he was really thinking about leaving them there, as the storm would get stronger and stronger. With a somber face, the boy says that his brothers had to learn the weight of their actions. Placing his hand on his chest, the man says he would respect the boy's decision. As they walked back to the mansion, Khan remembered the energy the boy emanated from his hands the moment he found him. Knowing that it was definitely not aura, he wondered if it could be mana, and think that if that were the case, this event would not be a simple fight between brothers. With a serious expression, the man decides that the best thing to do was to report to the patriarch. Calling a servant, he asked them to bring him a horse. Jin, who was watching the scene through the window, thinks that just as he imagined the man would tell his father, for in addition to being his guardian knight, Khan was also his watchman, and since that seemed like magic to the man's eyes, there was no way he could remain silent. Spiritual power. This was proof of the contract between Jin and Sodore, and thanks to this power, he discovered that the contract was also valid for this life. Furthermore, thanks to the immunity to the curse granted by Soddard to the contractor, the boy could escape the curse of the blade's illusion in this life. Closing his hand, our protagonist declared that the Run Candle Fool no longer existed, and that from that moment on, his life would be different. With a slight smile, he thinks that now he just needed to meet his father. In the middle of a forest, Khan had just reported about Jin's strange power to the Patriarch. Upon hearing all that, the Patriarch says that the man should gather the knights, as he would visit his youngest son. A while later, 207 knights had been summoned to guard the Patriarch. Among them 7 were Runkandal knights. The Patriarch says in that case they were going to the Storm Castle. As they marched towards the castle, a girl named Mary asked her brother if he knew what it was all about, because even asking Luna she didn't seem to know anything. Sighing, she comments that the woman seemed busy knocking out the mages from before. His brother, with his hand on his chin, says that the Tona twins would only arrive at the castle next year, so it shouldn't be because of them. Dipus then says that perhaps the Patriarch was planning to go see his youngest son. Mary questions why he would do that, and her brother reminds her that Jin had chosen the Patriarch's sword in the selection ritual, and he says that even if the boy chose the Patriarch's destiny, it was necessary. Mary comments that they could never know what was going on in his father's mind. At that moment, Luna Runcandle's first successor calls the two's attention, asking them to be silent. In thoughts, Mary says that for her father to be going to see the boy in person, the boy must be very useful. In the Storm Castle, a servant was preparing Jin for the visit. She asked if the Patriarch was there to see them, which the boy revealed he didn't know. While adjusting his shirt, the boy thinks that apparently the man had managed to quickly report to the Patriarch. As the man was someone who was adamant, Jin finds it likely that he only reported what he saw, and did not directly say that he had used magic. He imagines that the purpose of that visit was, in addition to observing what kind of power the youngest son was using, to also decide whether he would lead the clan to prosperity. With the opening of the gates, the arrival of the Patriarch was announced. The leader orders the Tona brothers to be brought to him. Sometime later, the brothers found themselves on their knees in front of the Patriarch, who says he heard about the fight, and asks what they had done. The brothers look at each other and say that Jin just suddenly attacked them, with a technique that didn't look like an aura, but a kind of magic. This intrigues the Patriarch, and the boys question whether using magic was prohibited in their clan. In denial, Mary agrees with the boys, saying that if Jin had really used magic, they should interrogate him. However, the Patriarch interrupts her, and catching the twins' attention, says that they should keep something in their hearts. With a serious face, he says that they would never survive in Runcandle like that. Those words leave the twins confused, and the Patriarch orders them to bring Jin there. While passing by the twins, our protagonist thinks that his father, Siren Runcandle, had been the strongest and coldest man he had ever known. The strongest being of that era, who was able to reach the level of a demigod, the Genesis Knight. Siren had already been someone normal. However, when he reached the level of a demigod, he ended up losing all the emotions that made him human, and with that he became a being who only had one blind obsession, which was the clan and its prosperity. For a father like that, someone who didn't have any talent like Jin was like a nobody. However, Jin says that this would be different in this life, and no one could ignore him. Facing the Patriarch, Jin bows, and the man questions why the boy calls him Patriarch and not father. Raising his head, our protagonist says that as there were several people from the clan there, he thought it was an official visit. This mentality impresses Luna, and the Patriarch comments that it was a great response. Jin thanks him, and the Patriarch reveals that he had actually come to the castle for other reasons, so he should call him father for now. Resting his hand on his sword, Siren says he would ask him the same thing he had asked the boy's brothers, and then he questions what mistake the Tona twins made. Closing his hand in anger, Jin says that everything he had done was for revenge. He finishes by saying that if someone is a member of the Runcandle clan, they must return what they received, whether hate or kindness. This elicits a macabre smile from Mary. The Patriarch sighs, and says that everyone there should leave, except Jin. At that moment, everyone starts to wonder if the boy had really passed the Patriarch's test. One of the flag bearers questions what they were doing while standing still, as the Patriarch had given an order. Then everyone leaves, and as she leaves the place, Mary smiles, thinking that Jin looks a lot like the Patriarch, and after all, her brother is not weak. Now alone, the Patriarch says that he had ordered everyone to go out to ask him something in private, and asks about the power that the brothers said he used. He reminds Jin that the use of magic in Runcandle was strictly prohibited, as once he learns magic he will never be able to reach the limit of swordsmanship. Finally, he questions the boy about what power that was, and says that if it were magic, Jin wouldn't get away with it. Our protagonist thinks about it, and realizes that now that his father knew about his power, the Patriarch would not let him escape his clutches, for that was the power of Sodore. The boy says he didn't know what that power was, but he could guarantee that it wasn't an aura or magic. He reveals that he doesn't really know what he should call it, and says that if the Patriarch didn't mind, he could give it a name. That power in Jim's hands impresses Siren, who realizes that it was the power that the first patriarch had wielded. Siren, noticing that it was the spirit of the Barasada, thinks that apparently that child was really destined to be the patriarch. The man reveals that this was the power of Sodare, the god of shadows. Jin questions whether this power really came from a god, which Siren confirms. He explains that the first patriarch, Sir Timar, had made a contract with this god, and this god had accompanied them since the birth of their clan. However, after Sir Timar's death, Sodare never appeared again. The reason was unknown to Siren, but this god seemed to have returned through Jin. Our protagonist says that in this case he has a question for Siren. He questions who was stronger between the patriarch and Sodare. Siren thinks for a moment, and says he has never dueled against a god, so he had no way of knowing. Jin broke out in a cold sweat at those words, and thinks that this was a response worthy of the most powerful man. The patriarch then calls out to Jin, and touching his head, he praises him, saying it was a great question, and that it had become another big topic for him. The man comments that apparently it was a great idea to visit him. Siren asks how the boy would use that power. Then our protagonist says that he would like to use it for the good of his clan. Hearing those words, Siren bursts into laughter, while saying that that was an interesting lie. He comments that the boy had defeated his older brothers and left them outside in the rain, and was now saying that he would use his power for the good of the clan. The patriarch then asks what he would like to do honestly. Closing his fist, the boy thinks that just as he imagined, it wasn't easy to deceive the man. In this case, he says that he would like to use this power for his own good. Siren becomes serious for a moment, and says that he now liked the answer, impressing Jin. As he left the place, the patriarch said he would keep an eye on the boy. With the door closing, Jin can finally relax. His knees were shaking, and he sighed that it was finally over. He thinks it would be good just to be able to use his power freely. However, now even his father was looking forward to his growth, something he didn't think was possible. Remembering his father's disregard for him in his other life, Jin thinks he could live a completely different life this time. A little later, Mary was looking for Jin. Upon finding the boy, Mary hands him a box. When asked what it was about, the woman says it was a gift from her. She gives it to the servant's hands, and with a smile says that he should cook and eat, so that he can become stronger. Jin watched Mary leave, and wondered why she was giving him a gift. Upon opening the gift, Gilly and Jin are surprised by what they saw, as the gift was the heart of a phoenix. Worried, Jin thinks his sister was missing a few screws, as giving that to a 7-year-old was crazy. Mary Runkondal, the 7th banner bearer of Runkondal, and a 6-star knight, also known as Mary the Stormy. However, she also has another little-known nickname, the Crazy Woman from the southern region. As he pulled out the chair to sit down, for Jin, the reason why that woman was giving him something like that was obvious. She wanted him to stay strong, to fight against her. Our protagonist thinks that if someone eats the heart of a phoenix at that age, they are likely to develop a tolerance to fire and increase their growth rate. And also remember that the phoenix heart was commonly used by magicians to safely summon a phoenix. He wonders if in this life he could summon a creature like this with his own hands. Gilly then arrives, carrying the plate of soup, made from the heart of the phoenix, and Jin thanks her. The servant comments that Mary had left a great gift, and says that he should eat it before it gets cold. Our protagonist says that before he starts eating, he would like to know what his brothers had to tell him. Disguisingly, the boys say that it all seemed a little too much for Jin to eat alone. Understanding everything quickly, Jin questions if they wanted a piece of it, and his brothers nod in agreement. In this case, Jin says they needed to do something for him first. The scene then cuts to a little later, where the brothers find themselves digging a tunnel, while complaining and wondering why they need to do that. Somewhere underneath that tunnel, there was a room where a person was inside some kind of incubator. A while later, the boys returned home exhausted. Jin welcomes them, while commenting that they had arrived earlier than expected. The Tona brothers, irritated, just ask him to deliver the soup to them soon. Our protagonist then opens the way, saying that he had left it on the table, which leaves Daytona looking like a fool. However, this animosity quickly disappears when they notice that there were only 2 tablespoons on the table. They question Jin about this, and the boy responds that he had just said he was going to share, but hadn't specified how much. Our protagonist, while leaving the place, tells them to enjoy it, and with hatred the brothers thank him. The rain fell heavily outside the mansion, and Jin, approaching the tunnel that the brothers had dug, reveals that he wasn't expecting much anyway, but the brothers had done the minimum. Checking the consistency of the wall, the boy thinks a 1-star spell would be enough for that thickness. Casting green magic, the boy comments that he was already getting frustrated with accumulating so much mana and not having anywhere to use it. Throwing his hands forward, he creates a magic circle, thus destroying the wall in front of him, and finally revealing what he calls the Runkandal's secret library. For Jin, being in a place like that was strange, because in his past life he couldn't get there. He remembers that his brother once said that an activation phrase was needed to open the gate. Placing his hand on his chest, he recites the phrase, declaring that the son of the run candle was there to comfort Moroccan. At that moment, the gate opens, revealing a huge library that impresses the boy. The run candle's secret library is a place that holds the clan's collection of secret tomes, and it was a place only allowed for flag bearers. As he entered the library, Jin remembered his brother's words, which said that the boy knowing that was useless since he couldn't become a flag bearer. Our protagonist comments that, in the end, that information ended up being useful. Upon arriving at the center of the library, Jin ends up being surprised by something, because right in the middle of the place there was an incubator, and inside it was a man with scales. Jin wondered if that being was human, or what he was doing there. Touching the incubator, the boy makes a surprised expression, remembering the oath he made to enter, so the boy deduces that it was the black dragon Moroccan. Jin had heard that Moroccan had lost to the first patriarch, and finally fell into a deep sleep, but he had no idea that this legend was real. However, he thinks that now is not the time for that, moving away from the incubator to look for the secret tomes. Like in a horror movie, the moment the boy takes his eyes off the incubator, the man begins to stretch his fingers. When Jin finds the tomes, he chooses a so-called secret tome from the famous swordsman clan, the Kungan clan. However, he realizes that the content was difficult to understand, only having 3-star theory. He would like to take it with him, but he would end up getting caught if he did. In this case, he decides that he would just copy a few pages every time he goes there. Days passed, and our protagonist continued his studies in the castle library, until suddenly he hears some noises coming from the next room. Jin gets up quickly, wondering who it was. After all, there was no one coming to the library at that time. Opening a crack in the door, the boy comes across a silhouette of someone with sharp teeth and spiky hair. Looking at our protagonist, Moroccan questions who he was. Jin is paralyzed, wondering what Moroccan was doing there and why he was awake, for in his past life he had heard nothing about the dragon awakening. The boy tries to calm down, remembering that the dragon was the clan's guardian. With a trembling voice, Jin says he is flattered by Moroccan's arrival. Upon hearing those words, the black dragon becomes angry, asking how they dared to call him a guardian and teach that to children. But it wasn't like he could stay mad at the boy. So frustrated he lowered his head. The dragon then reveals that he had woken up because he smelled a good smell, and it hadn't happened for a long time. But in the end, he was just a brat. He approaches the boy, and realizing what it was about, he questions the boy why he felt spiritual energy coming from him. Our protagonist tries to make a fool of himself, but the man repeats himself, saying that he still remembers this dense smell of spiritual energy very well. At this moment, Jin finally realizes that the reason the dragon awakened was because of his spiritual energy. Not believing that the energy was really coming from the boy, Moroccan looked for energy in the library. Jin thinks that if that were the case, he could test something. He then calls out to Moroccan, who happily asks if he knew anything. Conjuring a ball of spiritual energy in his hands, Jin asks if the man was talking about that. Seeing that, the old dragon asks if the god was joking, because in the end, his promised contractor 1,000 years ago was a little boy. After staying on the ground for a while, still with his head down, the dragon calls out to the boy, and he talks about the promise with Sodore, and says that he had to help someone, and that someone was the boy himself. He says he would tell the details later. However, now he was a little dizzy from having just woken up. Plus, it would be difficult for the boy to understand everything at that age. Still, he thinks he should introduce himself. Then transforming into his dragon form, he introduces himself as Moroccan, representative of Sartora, and last descendant of the first shadow beings. He also says that, according to his promise from that moment on, he would be with the boy. Jin is surprised by what he had just heard, referring to the boy as a Sodore contractor. The dragon asks what the boy's name would be. With a smile, Jin touches the dragon's claws, introducing himself as Jin Run Candle, the 13th and youngest son of Run Moroccan, Black Dragon. Mount Moroccan, where the Storm Castle is located, was originally named after the dragon, and the dragon Moroccan was a powerful ruler who reigned over the area for many years. However, 1,000 years ago, Moroccan lost the battle against the first patriarch Timarun, and they say that after giving up the mountain and the castle, Moroccan fell into a deep sleep. However, Jin knew that in the end, these two were actually friends. The god contractor is usually accompanied by a guardian dragon. Despite this, nothing was known about the Sodore dragon, being always a mystery. However, it made sense to be Moroccan, as he was in a deep sleep. Jin wonders if now that Moroccan was awake, he had gained a guardian dragon. Opening the door, our protagonist notified the dragon that he had returned, and he says that his nanny had prepared some snacks. Jin thought that from now on he would be with Moroccan, in which case he should question any doubts he had about him. Sometime later, it had been months since Moroccan had awakened, and Jin began visiting the library. Our protagonist questioned the dragon about why he fought against the first patriarch. This question surprised the dragon. Turning around with a silly face, the old man says that it was 1,000 years ago, and asks why the boy thinks he would remember. Changing the subject, Moroccan questions whether all those strawberry pies were his, and the boy shook his head in denial. In the meantime, Jin had discovered something about the dragon. He was crazy about pies. Our protagonist was cleaning a book until the old man questions what the boy was doing when he came there. Jin replies that he made transcriptions because taking the tomes would be suspicious. In this case, the guardian asks if he could understand everything that was there, to which he responds that he understood about 30%. Hearing this, the dragon laughs, seeing that even that monster was still human, and says that Jin shouldn't be upset as he was doing very well for his age. With his head down, the boy charged himself, saying that for a run candle, this was the minimum. He says he had 12 siblings, and he also had his father and mother, not counting the older ones. Therefore, if he wanted to overcome them, he would have to try much harder. Touching the book, the boy questions Moroccan. If he were the first patriarch, how much of that tome would he have understood? Our protagonist was curious about what level he would be when compared to the best in history. The old man asks if he was referring to Tima, and says that when the man was Jin's age, he couldn't understand a single sentence from that book. This impresses the boy, and the dragon also says that, however, theory was different from practice, and Timar fought well without reading books like those. Standing up, the elder says that the boy had talent, but not as much as Timar. So Jin sadly asks if he would ever be able to become like the first Lord Patriarch. Giving the boy a glimmer of hope, Moroccan says that wasn't exactly what he meant. He says that just like Jin, the Patriarch was a Sodare contractor, and the boy at that age already had the brains to read a book like that. Placing his hand on our protagonist's head, he says that the boy should train and stop being impatient, because if he did that, one day he would become so strong that he could perhaps surpass him. Looking at the elder, Jin questions if he really thought that. The old dragon then confirms, asking if he knew what Sodare's nickname was. Our protagonist reveals that he doesn't know, and Moroccan reveals that the god's nickname was Infinite, as his power had no limits. The same served for the power of his contractors. Patting the boy on the back, the elder says he would teach him a new skill to make him feel better. Jin asks what kind of ability it would be, and Moroccan says it was spiritual release. This makes the boy curious, and the elder explains that it was an ability that every being who used spiritual power should master. However, it was extremely dangerous to use without proper training, so Jin should be careful and learn calmly. Our protagonist asks what he should do, and the dragon explains that first of all he had to learn how to release mana. Hearing this, Jin asks why. In his thoughts he said he had already done this hundreds of times in his past life. Moroccan explains that spiritual liberation was about releasing and transferring mana, so he would train these 2 mana techniques for the next 3 years. With a serious look, Jin thought that 3 years was too long. Smiling, the dragon says he couldn't teach the boy an advanced skill without him knowing the basics. While the elder was saying this, Jin summons a sphere of mana in his hand, using the 2 techniques, and asks if he could learn them now. This scares the old dragon, who questions how he had done that, and the boy replies that he could do it before. He then asks if Jin could also use the transfer, and like magic, the boy moves the sphere from one hand to the other. Moroccan says that apparently the boy was very talented, considering that only geniuses can do something like that.